Mr. Hastings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My friend from New Jersey tried to, or equated the Statue of Liberty and Central Park with this designation of a wilderness area. Ms. Maloney, how many people, how many elected officials in that part of New York are opposed to Central Park and Statue of Liberty being designated or being federal land or parklands?
Oh, it is supported, I would say, by every American in America.
No, I'm asking about the elected officials in the close environs of New York.
They all support it as a national monument and
Thank
as
you very
a
much.
park.
Mr. Rieberg, you mentioned in your opening statement, and you being the only representative from a huge geographical area, how many elected officials are you aware of that support this in your jurisdiction?
None, including our 2 Democrat U.S. senators.
So we're even up at that level where that.
And Mr. Hastings, I might point out that we're not talking about the ownership of the land or the Statue of Liberty. We're talking about the management. And it would behoove us to remember that while we may receive letters of support or opposition, we really need to listen to many of the land managers in places like Montana, where the Forest Service suggests that the management within the existing wilderness oftentimes makes it difficult to manage the toxic weeds, to manage the dead and dying trees. And so I would never suggest, nor would I believe Ms. Maloney would suggest, that we want to override the engineer's decisions on the structural imperfections within the Statue of Liberty or Central Park. But that's exactly what they're doing in the case of interjecting their East Coast knowledge of natural resource management. And as I've said most recently, would you buy a car manufactured by Congress? Would you allow congressmen who have absolutely no idea, or women, about the management of the natural resources to go in and actively manage our forests for the betterment of the wildlife, of the ecosystem? And that's really the crux of the whole argument here.
There's been, I alluded to it in my opening remarks, Ms. Maloney said that private property rights are not affected at all in this bill. Now, you and I represent a district that has a lot of federal land. You obviously do in Montana. Can you give an example or two or a general overview of how private property is affected by management of public lands in our jurisdictions?
Well, the best argument I could make is a woman by the name of Margaret Reed, who was up in the Cook City area, whose land was surrounded during the Beartooth of Zorkie discussion, unbeknownst to her. And they started limiting access and her ability to use the land as she and her husband had used it in the generations before. And all the years I staffed this committee as a staffer back in late 70s and early 80s, and I was on this committee when it was called the Interior and Insular Affairs under Chairman Udall, we fought that issue of trying to bring relief to it, one single landowner, and she ended up in court. She ended up trying to appeal to the reasonableness of a federal bureaucracy that frankly didn't care, and the woman died before she ever got to see any resolution on access.
Hers was private land because of proximity to public lands.
Hers was private land and an active mine that ended up being surrounded by wilderness area. It was currently surrounded. It had access to her mine.
But it was my time's running out, but it was private land, and what happens is the proximity of public lands, therefore the jurisdiction or the governance of those public lands have an effect on private property.
That is correct, and for the greater good of the government, she never saw relief before she passed away.
And could this not happen, because I would assume that a lot of this land is probably higher elevation. In the west, the snow falls, and the higher elevation comes down as water. Could that have an effect on private property, perhaps water management, when it gets out of the federal lands?
Those are the issues that need to be addressed in this bill. Water rights, hard release, and appeals.
And they're not.
And they're not.
Good. Thank you very much, Mr.
Chairman. If I could clarify that water rights continue to be reserved as they are under current law. They're protected. We did write CBO to look at the cost, and they haven't gotten back to us. And in the last hearing we had, there was a report by an economic analysis by Michael Garrity, who testified 2 years ago actually on the bill, that the money that it saves money, a net savings of $245 million over 10 years, and that report can go into the record. But clearly, the intent is not to impose in any way, shape, or form on private property. Property rights are respected in this country, and certainly people have access to their property, and I'm not familiar with that particular case that he's talking about,
Chairman,
that particular woman.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I just want to make this observation, because this is always overlooked by people that do not have federal lands in their area of the impact it has. I see it all the time in my district, and I'm not impacted as greatly as others. I know the intent is never that way. I always hear that. The intent is not to do this. My goodness, the intent of the interpretation of the Endangered Species Act today is not what it was in 1971. I think most people would acknowledge that. But yet it has a profound impact. And to suggest that it doesn't, or the intent isn't, so everything's going to go away, misses the whole point. And I think this is probably the reason why. You don't see elected officials in areas that have federal land that are impacted by this, that gravitates to this sort of legislation, because they know firsthand, they see it on a daily basis, the impact that it has on their livelihood. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Before I turn to Ms. Shea Porter for any comments or questions she may have, it's my limited experience on this committee that many times legislation is introduced from one session to another, essentially the same language as the previous session. And then if that piece of legislation hits committee for markup, then we're in the amendment process, where we clarify, change, modify, perfect through members' amendments. And I think some of the concerns that have been raised today, if this bill gets to markup, we'll have that opportunity to deal with members' concerns through the amendment process, which in my experience has been the way it's been done in the